What are the pain points that you have? You've spent a lot of time and energy and resource on skills development training for your people, and they have not adopted the skills. Why is that? You are trying to get people to collaborate, to innovate, to lead inclusively, and they're not able to do that despite best intentions. Why is that? Silence.
Welcome to the Mindful Negotiating Podcast, where we talk about all the things that you're not supposed to talk about at dinner. My name is Max, and I'm your host along with Dr. Colleen. We are two conflict communication and negotiation nerds.
Thanks so much for that intro, Max. It was so beautifully said. I'm really excited for everybody to listen to this podcast today. We had Elaine Lin Hering on, and she just is an incredible speaker, teacher, writer, thought leader, and she gives us some really wonderful nuggets on silence and how probing the silence in your own life can give you some insight in areas in which you may be able to expand your own agency, your own power. So it's definitely worth a listen.
Here we go. Welcome to the Mindful Negotiating Podcast. It is so lovely to be here with Elaine Lin Hering, who is a facilitator, author, and speaker. She works with organizations and individuals to build skills in communication, collaboration, and conflict management. She has worked on 6 continents and facilitated executive education at Harvard, Dartmouth, Tufts, UC Berkeley, and UCLA. She's the former advanced training director for the Harvard Mediation Program and a lecturer on law at Harvard Law School. She has worked with coal miners at BH Billiton, microfinance organizers in East Africa, mental health professionals in China, and senior leadership at the U.S. Department of Commerce. Her clients include American Express, Chevron, Google, Nike, Novartis, PayPal, Pixar, and the Red Cross. She's the author of the forthcoming book, Unlearning Silence, How to Speak Your Mind, Unleash Talent, and Live More Fully. We're really, really honored to have you here, Elaine. And so our first question, and by the way, word on the street about Elaine is just that she's really cool as well, in addition to that really impressive background. So also really cool.
Don't trust what you hear on the street.
But the first question, Elaine, is can you tell us the story of your name?
I love how beautifully this question leads into the topic that we're talking about today, because my name is a story of erasure. So I was born in Taiwan as Ling Yi Liang in Mandarin. And when I came to the States, I needed a westernized name in order to be, to fit in, not be made fun of. And so that beautiful meaning of happiness and love and kindness that my great uncle analyzed to align with the zodiac is no longer present. So I am Elaine after a broadcaster in the 1980s called Elaine Corral in the Bay Area, because my parents were looking for something that vaguely sounded like Yi Liang, which was Elaine. And then when I got married, we had a whole debate as to whether I would take my husband's last name, whether he would take mine, hyphenation, the regular conversation. And I decided to take on Hering. And then I Googled, and Elaine Hering, the first search result was an obituary of an 86-year-old woman out of Texas named Elaine Hering. So don't look at the internet to tell you who you are or who you could be.
Great takeaway. Yeah.
We're starting with the takeaways already. It's going to be a really practical episode here on the podcast. And so I also didn't want to erase Lin, my family of origin, my culture, my background. Yeah. So that is how I came to be Elaine Lin Hering. 1 R. Sounds like the fish, but 1 R.
There's there, and we can go down several different paths. I guess my question as a child of parents that did not share a last name for their own cultural reasons, I always have some anxiety about how to display it in terms of honoring both of those lineages. And I'm wondering for you, the extent to which identity, if you consider your identity coherent, mixed, how you think about yourself and your relationship to self, and just how that simple display of your name in terms of being pragmatic, right? If we're in the Harvard world, it's probably better for me to be Maxwell than Massimiliano, right? Like, how do you navigate that?
I think you embrace wherever you are right now, right? Meaning, my best friend got married last year. We had a whole conversation as to whether she should change her name, lots of politics, lots of expectations, lots of interests.
Mm.
In the end, she decided not to change her name. And I said, look, if I were to go back and do it again, I would probably do it differently. And
Interesting.
I really don't want to redo all that paperwork right
Yeah,
now.
for sure.
And particularly going down this publishing path, I'm Elaine Lin Hering, and I'm okay with that. Right? Like there is such a richness, and I love getting to tell the story, and I love getting to parse it. But we are all a figment, a product of our life experiences, and I think Elaine Lin Hering tells that story of
Mm.
being a product of having to edit yourself, of negotiating with yourself, of landing at something. And that's where I am today. Doesn't
Mm.
necessarily mean it's going to be where I am tomorrow.
Elaine, are you trying to say that life is a process and change is a process and not a singular event that happened?
I don't know where you're getting that paraphrase, Maximiliano.
I love that you just used his name in that context. My question was going to be, is there a specific context? Like, do your parents still call you by the name they gave you? Are there contexts in which you do go back to your other name?
Not really. I mean, my parents don't call me Elaine Lin Hering. They call me Elaine because I think we are who we are today. And if I were to renegotiate that relationship, renegotiate that name, it's a conversation we could have. But I think that's also where agency comes into place of, as there are so many different things we're juggling and tackling, which my name isn't at the top of my battles to fight right now.
Mm.
Well said.
So something I'm thinking about, because in the Harvard negotiation world, something I was struck by was our kind of opening exercises, which were something like get on the floor and draw a self-portrait of you as a negotiator, or things that I would associate with, like family systems or more,
Mm.
things that are more woo-woo than I would have expected at Harvard Law School, which was a
Mm-hmm.
beautiful surprise.
Mm.
Um, but I'm wondering, based on the extent to which our family is the crucible that affects us, whether it's what produces our name or our conflict styles, is there a meaningful difference between unlearning silence at work versus in our family?
I'd say no. And the long pause is just thinking through that to make sure I really mean what I say. And the reason I say I don't think there's a meaningful difference is because, well, now I want you to define meaningful difference, but that's just my
Hmm.
lawyer legal
I love it.
training coming into play of how you're going to calibrate meaningful. But I would say no, in that everything is interconnected. So how we show up at work is implicated by what's happening at home, even if we believe that we are masterful at compartmentalization.
Mm.
It leaks out, and our assumptions are baked in the different experiences we have, either at work or at home. And a lot of that is unconscious, subconscious.
Hmm.
I'd argue that as high as the stakes feel at work for unlearning silence, meaning, are you going to get promoted? Are you going to be invited to that meeting? Are you going to lose your job? They often can be even higher stakes at home. So I don't think there's a meaningful difference. I think it's all part of life, and our relationship with silence is shaped by all of those different experiences, whether professional, personal, political.
Hmm.
Yeah. I'm with you. You talk about this really eloquently in your book, and I'm wondering if we could back it up even a little bit more, and you can talk about what it means to unlearn silence. What does that even mean?
Yeah, let's define our terms. I feel like we're back in law school here. So let's start with silence. Silence, because there's a lot of positive benefits to silence that I talk about in the book as well, in terms of brain cells regenerating, and you can't be mindful without silence. And there are some people that we wish would take a pause or actually withhold more. The silence I'm talking about that we might want to unlearn, or I'd argue we should unlearn, is when there's not enough space in the room for your perspective, when you aren't invited to the meeting and you didn't think that you could ask, when everybody else's priorities, preferences take precedent over yours. And so you are not present, not considered. And that can be silence that you enforce upon yourself in terms of self-silencing. That can be feeling silenced by the people around you because the consequences of using your voice and showing up are too high.
Mm.
So that's the negative, pervasive silence that I'm talking about. And unlearning is, let's recognize what we've internalized over time, what has become part of our unconscious, what has become habitual, and how do we excavate and wrestle with that and decide what do we want to keep and what do we want to shed. And of course, it is unlearning, because it's not, I've unlearned silence, check the box, I'm done. It's an ongoing process as we continue to interact with other human beings. And those same challenges and proclivities come up. And then begging a question of, well, why unlearning? Why not just learn more skills?
Mm.
Because as we all know, well, maybe we don't all know, so let me back up. How I came to the topic is just spending so much time, more than a decade, teaching skills for negotiation, difficult conversations, giving and receiving feedback, tools and frameworks out of the Harvard Negotiation Project, believing that there is utility to each of those frameworks. And despite the fact that people spent a lot of money and time and energy to come to these executive education courses or hire us into their companies, some people still wouldn't negotiate, still wouldn't have the difficult conversations, still wouldn't give or receive the feedback, no matter how much HR said they should or they knew they should.
Mm.
So, what's going on there? Because just continuing to layer on skills doesn't seem to be working, which is why, if we really want to do any of those things, negotiate, difficult conversations, feedback, we actually need to unlearn what undermines our ability to do those things, which is the silence we've learned and the ways that people continue to silence us, and the silence baked into the systems around us, is
Mm.
how I came to unlearning silence.
A very present theme that I'd love to explore with you, Elaine, at least for Colleen and I, has been the tension or difference between negotiation, communication in practice and in academia, or versus academia, in
Mm-hmm.
terms of our language being particular, where I would say absolutely like unlearning is, to my mind, the majority of things, right? We can peel anything away until we know what it is, and give it a name to some extent, which is something you talk about really in a wonderful way. I guess I'm wondering, like, you have such an authentic perspective that what I'm about to ask is like a very like corporate minded thing of me. But when you're approaching a learning and development department, right? Like I think academically it makes sense. Like, yes, your most of negotiation and development is unlearning, right?
Mm-hmm.
Becoming aware and peeling away. Less is more, so on
Mm-hmm.
and so forth. But I'm just curious if you can talk a little bit about any tension you've experienced between this authenticity, self growth, something that may even border on something that, for lack of a better term, might even be spiritual, and how that butts up against corporate education and publishing, doing interviews, etc.
I don't know if I would say I've experienced a tension there.
Hmm.
And maybe it's because whenever you are selling something, which is what you're doing when you, as an outside vendor partner, are having a conversation with an internal corporate education person, it feels like any other classic negotiation. Meaning, what is that person looking for? What problem are they trying to solve? Do I have an option? Right? If what's their interest?
Yeah.
Am I an option that makes sense? Why might I, as an option, make sense? And so the focus of those conversations is not on my name or the story of how I came to it, but what are the pain points that you have? You've spent a lot of time and energy and resource on skills development training for your people, and they have not adopted the skills. Why is that? You are trying to get people to collaborate, to innovate, to lead inclusively, and they're not able to do that despite best intentions. Why is that?
Hmm.
Silence. So the value proposition and the opportunity comes clear fairly quickly because we're anchoring, as we always do, to someone's interest. Yeah, that's probably where I'd land
That
with
makes a lot
that.
of sense to me. In your book, you talk about an example of an overly positive gym trainer who is inviting people to come train with him. And he thinks that everything is going well, and people leave, and he can't figure out why people are leaving. And when he asks, they say, well, you're just too positive for us. And I thought it was a great example of what I think is sometimes hard for me to get at when I'm talking with folks about conflict and negotiation, which is this idea that silence can be so many things, and it can be the invisible thing, which can sometimes lead to groupthink. What you so appropriately point out is one person's opinion dominating. And even if there's no reason to think that opinion is bad, right? Who would think
Mhm.
being positive in a gym is bad? It still is only one opinion. And the more
Mhm.
silence there is, the less opportunity there is for multiple points of view. And I thought, as you were just talking now about sort of unlearning silence in the separation between these two things, one thing that came to mind was that example from the book of the ways in which silence can be deadly, even when we think it's sort of like, oh, everybody's going with the flow, everything's okay. And I was curious to hear you talk even a little bit more, if you could, about getting comfortable with speaking up
Mhm.
when there's sort of this group think thing happening, and you don't maybe disagree with it. It's not like anybody's saying anything offensive, but it just isn't sitting right with how you would want to do things or what you think of it.
Yeah, to me, the punchline of that story is if you don't have different perspectives, not only do you get groupthink, right? We sort of intuitively know that groupthink could be dangerous, but what is even more dangerous is that you are essentially living in a skewed sense of reality because you don't have the data that is other people's perspectives. And so that to me is the value proposition of for everybody, but particularly for leaders, of getting different voices in the mix. I'm reflecting on the way you posed the question of how do you get comfortable with using your voice, because I'm not sure we ever quite get comfortable depending on the situation. And the reason I say that is because the stakes are real. Now, the costs of speaking up and the fears that we experience can either be real or perceived. And so we talk about present bias and self bias in the book and how to mitigate that in your calculation of whether it's worth it to speak up. And I'm not sure the fear ever goes away because those costs are real, particularly for people with multiple marginalized identities and power structures. All of that is real. But that's also why, for me, the question of speaking up and whether to do it isn't just one of courage. Right? Often you hear you need to have more courage, be more confident, go take some assertiveness training, then you'd fix yourself and you'd be fine and we could promote you and you might be successful. Fill in the blank storyline.
Yeah.
And for me, it's really a question of calculation.
Mm.
In my understanding, and this calculation is subconscious and really quick unless we make it conscious, unless I think it is worth it, it will make a difference for me to lend my voice on some metric that I determine for myself. It doesn't actually make sense logically
Yeah.
for me to speak up. But if I believe in something bigger or am oriented to a different cause, then despite my fears, despite it not being comfortable, it is still worth it for
Mm.
me to speak up. And I would argue in that context, avoiding living in a skewed sense of reality is worth lending perspective and also particularly inviting perspectives different than your own and being able to hear them.
I mean, I have two questions that go down different roads, and so I'm going to pose them both, and you take whichever.
Ooh, a choose your own adventure. I love it.
Yeah. On the one hand, I'm thinking about, I think it's a Michael Moffat article on learning how to learn to negotiate
Mm.
that talks about how people can have negotiated for decades. And the reason that they don't improve has a lot to do with avoiding information that's disconfirming to how they want to see themselves. So, like, kind of like you're talking about living in a reality warp. So that's one thing I'm thinking about in terms of, can we help people who
Mhm.
don't want to be here, or how can we, how does that negotiation go? Could that go? And then the other path
Wait,
that I'm
Max, I want to
yeah.
hear her answer that one. I want to
Okay.
hear her answer that one. And
Okay,
then
it's
go to
not
the
a
second
choose
Choose
your own
one.
adventure.
chosen.
I'm so curious to hear
Mhm.
your answer to that one. So I'm cutting him
Mm.
off. I want him to ask you both
Love it.
selfishly.
I love it. It's also a good meta level observation of my answer which is you just took away my agency to answer the question, but I will, as a matter of my own choice, answer it. Because to me, the difference comes down to agency. And that's a central tenet of using your voice is having the agency to choose. So as much as we and our listeners might all have a list of people that we want to wave that magic wand at and change them and have been working so hard to do, and just, I want you to be enlightened, like see the light. I also hold the stance that it is that individual's agency to choose when they are able to engage with disconfirming data or data that challenges their identity. Is it hard? Yes. And I think the work for each of us in terms of persuasion is knowing what is our work to do and what is someone else's work to do, and not taking on their work as our work. And so I see my work as I am naming a dynamic, I'm giving a name to a dynamic that exists. Whether or not you agree with me that that dynamic exists is yours to decide. Whether you choose to do something about it is also yours to decide. I have tried to write with as much compassion and clarity as I can possibly muster and tone down some of the anger that can be triggers for people. And that is the work that I can do. Whether they can hear me and whether they choose to agree with me is their choice. And I'll honor that.
That's so balanced, right? So where there is for me tension, it feels like there is for you balance here in terms of how do you tell a sufficient amount of truth and not sugarcoat things and name phenomena versus how do you make it as digestible as possible? Because even if you say something that is true that increases someone's internal voice such that they can't hear, then it's not effective. So, I mean, I think not only in the way that you speak, but the book is kind of a masterclass in this. Is like, hi, compassionate human. Like we all do things, right? I've silenced people too.
Yes.
I guess what I'm thinking about a very specific situation, which is let's say this is kind of like a let's say you have a client and you think they'd benefit from video review, right? Of recording their calls, and let's just say to make it easier, it's internal, it's role play, and everyone is happy about this. But the person who maybe could use the work really doesn't want to be seen on camera, doesn't think that they need to, either they're too senior or they're too self-conscious. My question is, what is an appropriate amount of influencing versus respecting agency for someone who is reluctant to look at the thing you want them to look at?
Yeah, or even have that footage created. It sounds like in the hypothetical. For me, it is, here's my analysis. Here's my analysis of the situation. Here is why it would be beneficial. Here's the experience I've had with other clients, whatever that social proof, the expertise, the data, all the things, if we're going on the ladder of inference, in your data set and your reasoning that leads you to your conclusion. And they can have a different ladder. The question then becomes, whose decision is it to make? Is it yours as the vendor partner advisor to say, this is what we're doing? Is it theirs to decide? Is there a third party? But let's get clear on decision making, and also the contextualization of they can have a different ladder. That to me is normal human communication. Part of silence is also diminishing and discounting our gut instincts and not listening to our bodies. And so I've taken much more of a stance of preserving autonomy and agency since thinking about this issue. And this is a real example. I was with a group yesterday. There's a senior vice president who did not want to answer the question that I posed about silence, and he was ready to put up a battle with me. And I said, cool, like, that's, trust yourself. Right? You know, your body knows, you know what you can take on today. I don't know that. I don't know your life history. I don't know what you went through last year. I don't know how triggering this is for you. I don't know what you have to do after this meeting, that if you open up that can of worms and can't put it back, because our lives and learning don't happen in the neat 45, 60-minute increments that we have in meetings. So I'm going to trust you and respect you because you're the one who has to live your life.
Hmm.
We can talk about the impacts that it can have on other people if you don't do this work, or the impacts they're already experiencing of you. And then we can talk about other options. Again, pretty classic negotiation, right? Of what's the real interest we're getting to versus I have to have you do, being positional and saying, I have to have you do this video review
Right.
exercise.
Right. This all makes so much sense when you say it, Elaine.
I'm glad.
I feel like, Max, that was a reoccurring theme as I was reading this. It sort of feels like, how do you point out the invisible, which is a
Mm,
really hard thing to do. And I feel like this book gets at some of the invisible, which is
mm,
really was a wonderful treat. And I mentioned that it led me to ask my student group um, a question about they're running different diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in their clubs, and I asked them to just pay attention to who's being silent,
mhm,
and nothing more than that, but
mm,
who feels comfortable speaking in your room and who doesn't. And that was a direct result of reading your
mm.
book, which I think is, you say at one point, you know of no other way to get at this than to interrogate and reckon with silence. And I love that word choice of a reckoning, that it's not a massive world shift, right? It's not like,
Mm.
and even you have some statistics on the benefits of silence. This is good for
Mhm,
us,
mhm,
but to really interrogate it. And I guess one of my questions is, this is a little specific. I work for the Center for Women in Business, and I was thinking about the way that you talk about silences having consequences,
mhm,
and specifically for women or caregivers, that one of those silences is their needs. And I
mhm.
thought that was a consequence that isn't talked about very much. And I wanted to hear you talk about how you came to understand a negating of self as a consequence of silence.
Everyone says you write the book that you needed. Maybe that gives you enough of an answer. I talk about this in the book too. I am the youngest daughter of a immigrant family from Taiwan that is of Christian faith. And so if you layer on deference and respect to elders in the form of silence, the acculturation of someone who identifies as female, of how women should show up. And this is Carol Gillian's work of women are supposed to be caring and supposed to be unflappable and supposed to be warm and likable, while, by the way, doing everything and not complaining about it because that makes you disagreeable. And then being an immigrant where you are inherently othered, you're carrying all those subordinated identities. So that led me to a place of burnout. That led me to a place of being in an unhealthy work environment. That led me to a place of people not knowing what I needed. And no one ever told me your needs don't matter. A lot of the messages we get, most of the messages we get, and often that we internalize, aren't vocalized. Right? People don't tell you necessarily to shut the F up. They just shoot you a look. And you get enough looks or one look from one person, and you're like, oh, I am never speaking up again in a meeting because it's just not worth it. From the career impact to the emotional impact, silence becomes a survival mechanism. Silence feels safer, except that our silence isn't just about us. Our silence creates the cultures, allows for genocide to happen, allows for oppression, allows for abuse, allows for isolation. And so part of that calculation of whether to use your voice, whether to speak up, whether to acknowledge your needs is really what culture, what world are we co creating? And since I get to take up space, at least here on this podcast, I'll say my hope is that as we do and prescribe in classic negotiation theory, everybody's needs matter. If you're a party to this negotiation, you have needs. So for women and people who think they are needy because they have needs, you are not needy. You are human. You are a party to this negotiation. Therefore, you have needs.
And Elaine, you talk about this mental hack that I absolutely love of thinking about individual interests, merely being a stakeholder. as being important to the collective by virtue of being one of many stakeholders in terms of the durability of agreements. I think this makes a lot of sense. I think the classical negotiation stuff that's so interest-based makes a few assumptions, and one of them is that interests are individual, that we each have them and they're discrete, right? And even though we do have a portfolio of interests that more or less, I have mine and you have yours. Something I think you're pointing at here, one of the reasons that I really love this is a reframe that's helped me as well to be assertive, which is to say it's actually empathy for myself, right? And we need to have this balance for durability. I think that kind of balcony view, or whatever we want to call it, understands self, or an entity of interconnectivity that's larger than just one person. And you mentioned your faith, and then I'm also looking at some of the implicit assumptions we have: don't talk back, respect your elders, don't air your dirty laundry, which were very much a part of my Abrahamic upbringing as well. And so I'm just, again, you seem to hold it with such equanimity. For me, these things tear me apart, and I'm wondering how you think about self versus collective. Is that the dichotomy, or are there other categories we should consider? And how your just overall worldview looks at it, given that we have intention, patriarchy and Abrahamic tradition.
I take the stance, as you articulated, that we're all interconnected, right? There is no separating self from collective, individual from collective. I am a product of the collective. I impact the collective. My choices impact the collective. And I'd say, part of the analysis is, what are my interests? What are your interests? And what are our shared interests? That has always been a piece of that. And I assume, sometimes incorrectly, that Max's well-being is a shared interest because you are human and therefore you are valuable, right? That is just a given that so often in our negotiations, particularly commercial negotiations, feels like you might even need to name it because we forget.
Yeah.
Right? We forget that humanity and just focus on the utility, which actually undercuts our utility. Humans are complicated.
It's so true. It's so well said. I'm curious, just because I am not bilingual, and as a communication scholar, I'm ever jealous. I feel like I will just miss out on life if I don't learn another language fluently. But I'm curious, just from a bilingual brain, how much, and maybe that's like asking you to look at the water you're swimming in. I don't know. But how much that contributes to your thinking on this topic, and your lens on it.
It's a great question. I don't know if I can tease it out other than appreciating that I am a product of my upbringing and the cultures I've navigated. And what is maybe amusing to me, and then your producers can cut this if it's not useful, is my mother reading my book, which I was terrified about. Like, if I know that she is listening to a podcast that I'm doing, so hopefully she doesn't find this one, I'm just like, I feel the need to edit myself. It goes deep. I'm now 4 years old again instead of the age that I actually am. But what was interesting is English obviously is not her first language. So she said to me after reading an advanced copy, "Can we talk about your book?" And I went, "Oh no." And then I coached myself to, yes, of course, because I care and am in relationship with you. And so she came with a list. The book is only 197 pages. I think the list was like 80 something page numbers. And I looked at the list and I coached myself to breathe through it. And a lot of her questions were actually just English language questions, which broke my heart because we've been in this country almost 40 years, right? I'm flashing back to when I'm editing the memos she used to write to her boss because her boss gave her a hard time because her English wasn't perfect. There are some sentences in the book that I will admit are like overly floofy. I think I'm still finding my voice too. It's part of my process of unlearning silence. And so I don't mean floofy. It's like talking as if you came from Harvard because you don't trust yourself enough to value your opinion enough. So you're going to talk about it in a certain way. And then I don't even see how that's baked in anymore. So there are some of those where, it's like a 20-word sentence and she's like, "Oh, We have a 成语, which is a idiom. We have a Chinese idiom for that. 4 words, blah, 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 blah. You didn't need 20 words. And I was like, you are correct. You are correct. And so maybe that's more of a dance of cultures and languages, and what it has offered me really is an appreciation for continued learning and an appreciation for differences of perspective, that the world is so big and we are all so different, culture being only one of the lenses and language being only one of the lenses that can divide us, but that there are such universal truths when it relates to our humanity. And so that just being in conversation with different people, and now a much broader community about unlearning silence. Someone posted about a talk that I did on unlearning silence, and she says, I'll read it. As a language enthusiast, I would like to bring up a Finnish word which stands for frustration, turhatava. If you've got any Finnish people listening, coach me on how I've butchered that word. But turhatava apparently is not merely frustration. It includes the expression of something being in vain, pointless, or wasted, turha. And exactly this is usually the reason for silencing and frustration, right? We stay silent because using our voices feels like it's in vain. I think there's a beauty to language and culture to capture different things that English alone often doesn't have words for.
I even wonder if English is uniquely poor or impoverished in its conflict vocabulary, which I think means necessarily, I mean, regardless of which language you speak, that borrowing from other systems of thought and thinking is essential to capture the phenomena of things that we can't necessarily see in our own prism.
Which requires a couple of things, including one, that we see the value of cultures and approaches different than our own, and also that we don't do it in an extractive way.
Yeah.
Okay, but you see the complexity and understand the history of how you got there, which, Colleen, is why I love the question so much of how did I get to a certain observation? Because there's always a story. And if we're lucky enough to hear it, there's just such richness there.
Yeah. Yeah, that tension, I just want to say that tension comes across in your book. The tension of being frustrated with silence, but also having great reverence for it. And it was refreshing to read that, to not sort of sit down with this polarizing, here's why this is bad, engage with this argument and give me your best one. It was more of like, here's a complicated thing that has been a part of my life and that I've wrestled through, and here's why I think it's worth wrestling with. Which I just want to say, I thought that hearing you answer that, I had no idea that story of it and your mom reading it and all of that, but I feel like that came across in your writing, that tension that really carries the book.
I'm glad to hear that. And 2 of the words that she asked me to define, one was hangry.
Yeah.
I'm also teaching her to use Urban Dictionary, which feels really dangerous. But that was part of our conversation. And the other term she asked me to define was dad bod.
Oh.
Which,
yeah,
humor is a really good thing.
I always want to be in a room when someone is translating neologisms or idiomatic phrases. Like,
yes.
I love it.
How would you 2 define dad bod if you had to explain it to someone who didn't speak English or know the phrase?
I just look in the mirror.
Yeah, I would say the slightly soft body that occurs when you're taking care of other people, kind of time to take care.
Or not caring for other people and trying to coast on that assumption, for sure.
Yeah. Yes.
But sometimes I think also it has like a little bit of used to be athletic and is softening in the way that, the decades bring on stresses. So does it bring on layers of other things sometimes?
That is really helpful. I will try either of those definitions in the future rather than Googling it and then showing her images, which is how we answer the question.
Yeah, I was nervous to give any physical examples of a dad bod, though I find a dad bod endearing. But it's interesting.
This is what we need to hear, at least on the male side. We need this.
Yeah.
It's interesting also to think about translating, which is wrapped up in all of this,
Yeah.
translating what's happening in a room, translating the way that that's affecting my own thought processes or whether I'm going to speak up or not. And I was thinking, this is a little bit of a side, but Max and I both love movies. And I was thinking about how Greta Lee got a translator to work on that movie Past Lives with her because she felt like just having someone teach the language wasn't enough, that she really needed a very nuanced translator who could translate jokes and translate affect and sort of this whole picture. And language is very complicated. And so, as people pick up this book, I'm excited for them to grapple with those complexities and to think about the way that those language or lack thereof are still pieces of communication that are happening in a negotiation. And that, to your point, and you said this very well earlier, they have agency over, right? That the most important thing is that they can look at it and decide whether or not they have agency. I guess my question out of that is also a tough one. I'm sorry. Some tough questions today, but you've answered them well. So I'm like, okay.
We're here to talk about the real things. Let's do it.
Yeah, I am curious about at what point that agency became maybe more important than lack thereof, or it really set in for you, and what that journey was like.
Let's start with how I entered the field of negotiation theory and practice, because it's easy to note agency and say it's important. And maybe I'm doing the nuance thing again, right? It doesn't always feel like we have agency. When you come out of grad school, there's often this question of, well, I'm going to take what job I can get because no one's hiring, right? There was just a financial crash, all the different things of real life. So I came out of law school intending to be a litigator. I knew that I was interested in facilitation, and I didn't know it was called corporate education at the time, but helping people develop the skills to communicate more effectively made me alive in a way that sitting at a computer, looking at contracts all day for 13 hours did not. I had that nugget of observation. And I got the advice that I think most people get, which is you can't be in this field unless you have a head of gray hair, 10 years of experience at least, and preferably you're a white man. And I didn't have any of those things going for me, if that's the paradigm. So I resigned myself to practicing law. This is the long version, so feel free to cut it. That is not helpful.
Well, the long version is the one that we want.
Okay.
Just when you came to understand your own agency, or if there was a moment of choice in that.
Yeah. I felt very lucky to join a leadership development firm that was willing to give me the opportunity to teach and facilitate. You know, it sort of feels like you win the golden ticket when the experience or the narrative is that you're not allowed to do it. So I grew up teaching someone else's content. I understood my job as to amplify their voice, and that is part of, I'd argue unintentionally, of the system or the players, part of how I came to doubt whether I even had a voice. Because when you spend so much time solving for everyone else's interests but your own, again, same thing about, we were talking about women's needs, you forget that you have interests of your own or agency of your own. And I'm like a good Asian daughter. So I played by the rules. I want to be a team player. I am helping other people launch their books. I am running the business, making things smooth, wondering when it is going to be my turn. I am told anyone can do this. Just take your turn, take up space. And yet there's just not enough hours in the day if you're going to keep holding the things that maybe other people should be holding. And I hit a point of frustration and painful burnout. And I think this is useful advice for everyone, which is don't let other people's priorities hijack your own, because we each have one life to live. So are you living intentionally? Are you living in a way that if you were to die tomorrow, not to make this morbid, right? That you would be proud of and feel like you had lived in alignment with how you want to spend the energy that you have on this earth. And so that to me was part of agency, of remembering we do have choices.
Mm.
You have options and you have alternatives. If we're going back to the seven elements, right? And so choosing then to look at and explore what are the options.
Mm.
If we're staying at the table, what are the alternatives? Does this make sense? What makes sense for me? And remembering that question.
Mm.
It's also true of the observation of silence, though, which is silence, I would argue, is not inherently bad. We need more of it at some times, but the difference between silence that is additive or oppressive
Mm.
is agency. Do I get to choose when I want to be silent? If I'm choosing to be silent and you're saying, no, I have to talk, no, you have to do that video recording review, that's different than if I'm choosing voice.
Mm.
So, am I choosing silence or is it silence that is chosen for me?
Mm.
To me, is the key distinction of whether silence is additive or oppressive.
This brings up, I think, the idea. It brings up many things. One of them that stuck out for me because I experienced it was the low power double bind that you talk
Mm-hmm.
about. That if you don't speak up, you go unnoticed. If you do speak up, you get rejected. And
Mm-hmm.
then when you then say, "Okay, I'll try being obedient," and then your review comes up, we really would have liked to hear more of your voice, right? This cruel game. And I think there are many ways. I mean, I think this is one ambiguous tool that's used to say and do other things. But I'm wondering, for someone who feels like they're in this position, how do you negotiate that double bind?
Mm. To know that it exists is step one, because not knowing leads to a lot of the destructive messages that we often internalize, like, you're the problem, you're not good enough, if only you would change, then it would be okay. The other is to acknowledge reality, which is that voice, any action that you take, any words that you add to a conversation, voice is inherently a status claiming activity, is what the research says. And for voice to be heard requires that that status is accepted by the parties in play. Now, if we take the principle that we articulated earlier of what we can control and what we cannot control, that gets really interesting here, which is we cannot control whether they accept us, but we can control what we put out there. And of course, the two are interrelated because everything is interconnected. But success in speaking up to me is, have I shown up in a way that is in alignment with how I want to live? Because voice is not just the words that I use, but how I move through the world. Whether people hear me, whether people change as a result of it, we'd love that. That is not within our locus of control, right? Our agency. It is their agency to decide whether they hear us, which is also why half of the book is spent on coaching people how not to silence each other, right? This is why listening across differences matter, not for listening's sake, but so that we don't end up in skewed senses of reality,
Mm.
so that we honor each other's dignity, so that we can create spaces of belonging, all of these different implications, including, though, what is my work to do? What is someone else's work to do? Because whether it is change or collaboration or getting to outcomes on this project, it's going to take all of us, even if each of us has a role to play.
Mm. Elaine, you talk about the to rewind just a little bit, and that's beautiful. You reference the Babel theory of leadership or something like this, which I love.
Mhm.
And this book is so well researched. So there are a few questions coming out of this.
Mhm.
um, that basically, the more someone talks, the more it is perceived or it's implicit acceptance of their status role.
Mhm.
Colleen and I joke about writing a book called Talking About Listening because, at least where I'm coming from, so many people talk about everything. But ideally, you'd think that leadership demonstrates or shows. And so we also talked about sometimes the status hit you could potentially take by asking a question, which
Mm.
I think to our ears or our minds, and I think, gender and sex and identity
Mhm.
are fully
Mhm.
here as well. Um, But if we want to create, I guess my question is like, how do you deal with like the bad actor or the person who's very happy to babble? And we all know like who that is, like in our meeting, that we just want them to shut up
Mm-hmm.
and we don't say anything out of decorum. But there's then this implicit dynamic of like, well, I guess we've elected you in our silence in some ways.
Mm. I think you change the process, right? So if there are three negotiations going on at the same time, and I have seen those as three levers for voice in the book, that we often talk about the substance. Hey, you're talking too much in the meeting. The relationship, I'm worried now about how this is going to impact our relationship. And depending on how we're situated, that may have negative consequences on me. And what we're not talking about is the how of how we're running the meeting. And that's so underutilized. It's such a low-hanging fruit tool in the mediation world. Why do we not use it in other instances? Why do we not design the meeting differently to limit and reduce the liability of that wiring, that personality? It's not to say that you don't have the feedback conversation with that overtalker, because that feedback, particularly the impact that it has on the team, that is a necessary conversation. There's the underlying piece of, if you're uncomfortable having that conversation, what role silence plays in your analysis, but we could have that conversation separately. And so much of what we do happens by default of the way we've seen things done, of the way things have been done. And we're not thinking about, how might I design this meeting differently for whatever purpose we've called this meeting? And does it even make sense to have a meeting? Because the meme that the meeting should have been an email exists for a reason. But I'd start with the process piece of, how would you redesign the meeting, from the agenda to the questions that you're asking to who's facilitating to the expectations, because a lot of those levers end up solving more thoroughly what can be perceived as an interpersonal dynamic.
And you've mentioned this, even that the process is negotiable is news to many of us. And in terms of, changing the status quo, we have to acknowledge that before we can even make a different choice.
And to acknowledge that if you are more junior, it may not feel like it is negotiable, but I would use the same influencing, because what's in it for them frame of, let's re-examine how, or in our next meeting, let's try this, because I think it will help us be more productive, right? Clear value proposition, clear proposal. They can say no, but most times it's like, oh yeah, never thought of that. Yeah. And if you're telling me it'll lead to greater productivity, sure, let's try it. Yeah. Worst thing we do is we go back to the old way, which everyone inherently knows is not working anyways. We just haven't stopped to think that there could be a different way.
Right.
I know we're at time, but I wanted to say my takeaway, because I really want to underline it and punctuate. It was so great. You said the difference between good silence and bad silence is agency. And it was just so simply summed up. It's like, I know it's something that I'm going to be thinking about for a bit. So thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely.
And I have so many more questions about Ephesians 3:20, about interconnectivity, but also just want to say thank you so much for coming on. You are a person in this space that I look up to, and that helps me as I try and navigate what is hopefully a non-traditional path of a kind. And I think that's so obviously necessary when we see that status quo needs to change in so many places. So I guess I'll end with one question, if I might. Just about, again, you did so much research for this book. My favorite little fact or finding was that I guess children ask about 125 questions a day and adults only 6. Yeah. And I'm wondering if in all of your research, you just had a favorite study or something that you like, just a takeaway for you.
I really want us to end on a hopeful note. And so I don't really want to share my favorite research, because the research that was most helpful to me was the research that says there are really deep health impacts, from cardiovascular health to increase, cancer, digestive issues, hives, skin rashes. Basically, silence, when imposed upon you, is not good for your health, shortens lifespan, has the same health impact in terms of loneliness as obesity and smoking. And that to me was like, this is real.
Yeah.
This is real and it matters. And when our bodies are telling us something, or you get those manifestations of lack of health that we so often in our culture just push through because we silence what our bodies are telling us, there's real impacts. And so this is part of why there is such wrestling as to whether this is a straight leadership book or whether this is a personal growth book. Again, then my own frustration of why does it have to be in a particular category or box? Why can't it just be? But it goes back to our conversation of interconnectedness.
Yeah.
Right. And so really the hope is health.
Yeah.
Health for individual people, health for relationships, health for this planet, for this world, for how we coexist, and unlearning the ways we silence ourselves and silence other people, I think is one way forward to help us get there.
And that's a beautiful way to end. I thought for sure you were going to talk about the toilet and bacteria. But you know, we don't have to go.
That's a good cliffhanger. Go read the book.
Colleen, if people want to know more about this, where's the best place for us to find Unlearning Silence?
Yeah, Unlearning Silence is available for purchase wherever you buy your books. If you want to hear more of my voice, you can also purchase it in audiobook fashion. If that is a disincentive, then forget that I made the comment. And if you are looking for quick inputs, I have a monthly newsletter that is free that you can sign up for on ElaineLinHering.com.
Beautiful. Can't recommend the book highly enough, or working with Elaine. And again, thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to hang with us.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Elaine. Please come back sometime.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Colleen, indeed, listening to Elaine is so soothing, and she's such a lovely guest, as we were just saying, and then decided we should just be recording what we're saying.
Yeah, she was wonderful to have on the podcast. And it was a master class in so many things, the most obvious of which is negotiation. So I would say for anyone who listened to that, listen to it again, because as somebody who's listened to it twice, I got new things through it each time.
Yeah. I think mastery or masterful or master is the word that's coming to mind. If I'm being concise, it's masterful and it should be listened to multiple times or at least once. If you're looking to listen to what a strong, balanced negotiator sounds like, or ought to sound like, aspires to sound like, that balance of empathy and assertion, neither but both. She demonstrates negotiation as a way of being, a way of speaking, a way of thinking, and it comes out. And exactly what you said, it is a masterclass.
So maybe we can start here, Max. She talks about a couple of different negotiation terms that I thought maybe we should define for some of our listeners. So the first that I feel like we've been talking a lot about, are positions and interests. Yeah. Can you just break down what that means?
A position, most of us speak in positions. Positions are what we ask for. They're like the terms of a deal. They're literally the positions we take. I'm pro this, I'm anti this. And that, has its place. And the negotiator, the mediator, someone facilitating negotiation, is looking for the interests, which are the underlying motivations behind the position. Ideally, a person's position of what they want, like say they want a 10% raise, it has an interest beneath it. Like it could be the prestige, it could be because you're starting a family, it could be many things. And the idea is that by uncovering the actual interest, we could potentially build options, things we could do together that meet the party's interests, that are even more value constructive than their original position. And in fact, a positional dynamic is often destructive because you're not exchanging information. It becomes a very ego thing. Or as I think Fisher says in Getting to Yes, a new interest emerges in a negotiation, which is saving face. So ego often tied to position. And I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but maybe you've been at a party or in a conversation and maybe you're actually convinced of someone else's perspective, but you've already taken the perspective you took. And And that's the idea of like ego identifying with positions, and the idea of being positional. The classic positional bargaining happens in a flea market. You're just exchanging numbers. Oh, 15 denarii. No, 3 denarii, because we're in a place and time that uses denarii. Yeah. What would you add, edit, delete?
No, I think that's a great breakdown. In conflict, we borrow from negotiation. We talk about positions as those things that I'm aware of and I'm making my other party aware of, and interests as those things that I might not even be aware of, but certainly my other party isn't immediately aware of. Maybe, like you said, they're working to uncover that, but those underlying motivations that are driving my positions, and that if we can work together to uncover those, that's sort of like the gold standard, right? Of working together in conflict, you and I against the problem. And as we uncover those interests, hopefully then we also can get creative. We learn something we didn't know. It's new information, and we can come to a more creative solution.
Well, I would just add the image that is typically used that I find helpful is the iceberg. That what we see, what's visible, what people share are positions, but underneath a much more substantive, bigger, like massive things are underlying fears, drivers, concerns, hopes, goals, etc. And that's what sunk the Titanic, the bottom part of the
people's positions on, well, no, I'm just kidding. Yes, the iceberg. But I appreciate you bringing up the iceberg illustration, because that is a very helpful one in thinking about positions and interests, and applies to a lot of the conflicts and negotiations that we're having all the time. Not to make you Mr. Dictionary, but I am going to ask you to define one more term, because we talk about it in a couple podcasts, which is the ladder of inference. And Elaine brings it up.
What is that?
Elaine brings it up in this context of, you ask her this question about, Moffat has this article, Negotiating to Negotiate. And there's this discussion around, how do you actually prepare someone to negotiate? Well, what if somebody just doesn't want to hear things that are disconfirming with their own beliefs? And she says, everybody has their own ladder, which I thought was really interesting. We should just extrapolate on that a bit more.
That's so funny, because I almost brought up the ladder of inference in talking about positions of interest, in terms of interests help clarify your ladder. So the starting point is this: everyone has their own ladder, and that is what we need to remember. That ladder is a metaphor that I think this guy Chris Argyris uses back in the day, in like action learning, action science, with Diana McLean Smith and someone else, that is several rungs on a ladder of moving from the intake of information to our actions and beliefs and conclusions and all of that. It's several rungs. And in the negotiation space, the program on negotiation space at Harvard, it always gets represented as a 3-rung thing. So we draw first a little pool of and we all draw it the same way. It's like, by the way, just really quickly, we're going to have someone talking about cults at some point. I talked to this guy, and he was like, there's a way that transcendental meditation teachers are trained to draw something and do something. And they all do it the same way. And I've noticed that, because you go in for checkings, and I've done that. I'm like, I saw that done 15 years ago, and it was exactly the same script. So anyway, this is one of those things that is, for whatever it's worth, as we also look at the phenomena of PON in its own religiosity or cultishness, the ladder of inference is one of those things. So you draw a little pool at the bottom, and that's your pool of available data. And then someone stands in front of the room and says something like, any of the senses that we have, any of our 5 senses are bringing in data, but there's so much data that we can only select some of it. And that's the first rung of the ladder, selected data. That right there is a really big idea, that there are many things that are available to us that we're not selecting. And there are many things that are in other people's pool of available data that we don't share. The story I would use in the room most often, never really successful, but I really liked it, was the story of Romeo and Juliet. The idea that she sends that letter to the friar, or the friar sends a letter being like, don't worry, I'm not really dead. And then Romeo doesn't get it. And the tragedy is the ladder of inference and the lack of shared data, right? Makes a different assumption because they don't have that shared data. So in terms of going from positions to interest, the idea is also I want to understand where you're coming from, because you're speaking at the top of your ladder, but we'll get there. So you select some data, usually things that pop out that are most important. And so those might as well be the things that you fear to some extent. And here's where confirmation bias, which is where we select the data that we're already looking to confirm our existing beliefs. So again, selecting this data is, we already have problems from the start. We then interpret that data, which is just to we make a story out of it, right? We don't just see data absent some type of value judgment or story. And then based on that story, we make a conclusion. And the idea is that we share our conclusions. They could even be our positions. No, not so much. But the idea is that people argue at the top of their ladder in conflict when it's unproductive. I think this. No, I think this. And where the move, what we say is walk someone down their ladder, right? Okay, I hear you saying that you're, pro Second Amendment. Great. Can you tell me more about that? What exactly do you mean? Or when someone makes a generalization or interpretation, you might be asking for their data, right? Sometimes that can be confrontational, and how you do it is different. But the idea is someone is probably not ready or willing to listen to your ladder until you've walked down theirs and repeated it back accurately to them. There's a bit more to it in terms of our operating assumptions and all the cognitive biases that go into it. But basically, we all have our own ladders. Sometimes we don't have the same data, which is the cause of destructive conflict. Sometimes we have the same data, but select different data. So someone in finance versus someone in HR is going to look at reports differently. They're looking for different things. Where you sit determines what you see, especially in conflicts. Interpretation based on our previous experiences in the world, how we were brought up. We interpret certain data differently. Someone's raising their voice, they're excited or they're angry, depending on our families of origin. Then we reach a conclusion. And you could theoretically have the same data, similar interpretation, and a different conclusion. For example, I do some sessions with US Army. There's this we stay at this Disney resort, which military and Disney together is fascinating. But some people are really like Disney because their families get to go, and other people really don't. And so I think at one moment we looked outside, same data, we saw rain. It was oh yeah, it's raining. It's not nice out. Same interpretation. Conclusion: this is so great, or this is awful. The people were saying that this is awful. It's oh, Disney got rained on. And I was yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Then the other people were this is so great. Disney is so creepy. And we had a debate to start off the session, just with those ladders. So again, the ideas and the cognitive mastery that Elaine demonstrates is simply to identify that there are multiple hours. And sorry to blabber on about this, but this is the fundamental thing. You want to move from your ladder as much as possible, detach yourself, distance yourself, cognitive distance, and sit on what Yuri calls, I think it's Yuri, the balcony, right? And getting to that balcony is what it's all about. That's not an easy thing, right? He talks about some, famous leaders who went on walks or bicycle rode or journal to get to their quote unquote balcony. But this is to me the project of adult development, is getting to that balcony and sitting there and seeing the entire, what they say, the dance floor, all the stakeholders and their ladders, and understanding it and thinking from that perspective rather than just your own ladder. And I have painful firsthand experience in my own family of not everyone can identify or get off their ladder. And we also say it's very dangerous to ask someone to jump from the top of their ladder to yours. If you were on a roof cleaning gutters, you wouldn't try and jump from one to the other. You need to walk someone down before you then walk up yours, which is to say, I think this, here's the data I'm seeing, here's how I'm seeing it, therefore X, Y, and Z, which at least enables someone to interact with your way of thinking, even if they disagree with the conclusion.
That was such a thorough explanation. It's interesting because Max and I are in slightly different worlds in terms of negotiation versus conflict, and we both do both, but maybe use those tools slightly differently, or we're given slightly different tools. And the ladder of inference for me is a very negotiation-based tool that made sense to me much more. I'm so glad that you talked about the balcony and talked about the metaphor of height and perspective, because that made so much more sense to me when I understood the fullness of it. We in conflict talk a lot about, which is really similar, what's more circular and more iterative. I think it's called the circle. It's not a circle of inference. It's a circle of perception or something like that. But it's a very similar model, which is that you have an observation, you introduce your own perceptions, you make a snap judgment, you then challenge what you knew existing information with that snap judgment to refine. And it follows this sort of iterative pattern of inference. I think both are really helpful in different domains, but I think the main thing to take away in listening to Elaine and that discussion is that everybody is doing this all the time. And to your point, they're doing it with their own cultural background, their own experiences. And that information is much more influential than the new information that they're taking in. And so in the context of what Elaine was talking about, she so eloquently sort of weaves this throughout the whole podcast. And this is true in her book as well, which is this idea that like you cannot change somebody's ladder of inference.
Right.
You cannot change
down the ladder. Yeah, that's not the way to do it. Yeah.
You cannot say don't think about things that way. You cannot say speak up when you don't feel like speaking up. You can't say be quiet when you don't feel like, and instead, part of what I think she articulates really well is this idea that individuals are maybe most influenced by somebody who's willing to listen to their own worldview and believe it, and believe them, and believe that they are the best authority and agent in their own decision making.
I agree with that. And I'd push back on it when people have opinions about things that like are policy or beyond their own experience, whereby I think it's sufficient and respectable. And like, this was a big learning for me that I could disagree without being disagreeable, to say, I believe the exact opposite, and I can see why you believe what you believe, and really demonstrate that understanding. And that if you're in those shoes, like that's what you would think, right? If you are raised in Gaza versus raised elsewhere, if you are raised on a certain side of a conflict, the data that you're bringing in is very different, right? And if your contact point, and this is kind of like broaching on contact theory, the way that you come in contact with other cultures and people and groups absolutely like influences what you think of them in terms of what you're shown, but that is part of a larger system of things. Anyway, I just mean to say, back to Elaine, she demonstrates unconditional positive regard is what I think I mean to say. And I think that's Rogers, and Carl Rogers writes on a way of being, or on a way of being. And again, like Elaine is just, to my mind, demonstrating that not only is unconditional positive regard nice, but it's effective in terms of people changing or updating their beliefs. Otherwise, there's even an argument that Adam Grant makes that you immunize them, that you make their resistance stronger, because like as they are attacked or have their sense of self-coherence or worldview shaken.
Yeah. Inoculation theory, which is a communication theory we love, comes out of the communication field that Adam Grant then popularized.
Okay.
It works.
But I'd also love to get your take, because I feel like I've gone on and on about program on negotiation and kind of my world, but I'd love to hear more about how you see communication, how the fields fitting together or not, where they differentiate meaningfully, and what's kind of just the same shit.
It's so interesting because I feel like if you, Elaine, and I had a whole day to just like have a retreat and talk about these things, we would find so many domains of overlap that linguistically differ. So, and have maybe slightly different, like, I almost feel like, let's see if I can articulate this thought because it's more visual for me than it is substantial right now. But I almost feel like we start walking from different places and end up sort of crossing the same terrain. But so Elaine mentioned, this idea that part of what made her write this book was that she was running these workshops out of the Harvard Negotiation Project. She was giving these people really high level skills to deal with conflict, to deal with negotiation, and ran into this wall of still not feeling like there are some people for whom those skills will never penetrate because they just they have their own baggage, they have their own perspectives, they have their own shit that is getting in the way of better utilizing these skills in front of them. And I feel like, I don't know if it's communication specific, but it definitely is the mentors that I've had in conflict who come from a therapy background or who come from a psychological background of, we sort of start in the other place, which is like, here's somebody who's really conflict avoidant. I have no interest in giving them any tools. I just want to understand why they why they feel conflict avoidant is effective, because they've decided in their life that is the most effective thing for them.
It meets their interest.
It meets their interest, and it could be positional as well. Like maybe they've, grown up in a family where every time there's a conflict, it resulted in terrible name calling. It resulted in people leaving one another.
Well, just really
I
quick,
think,
sorry,
no,
just
go ahead.
really quickly, defense of conflict avoidance. We do say in terms of the styles, and this is a whole other thing. Yes, some like if someone like tries to fight you on even jujitsu, or like, yeah, don't get into a fight. It's like a really bad idea. Really not worth it. Doesn't accomplish your long-term goals. So like it's maybe even survival system. I just want to say that there's a place for conflict avoidance, though I think we overutilize this, at least in like the US professional landscape.
Totally. I agree with you. I mean, thinking about, we sort of discreetly broken up conflict styles into 5 at this point, which is like not fair and probably very limiting, but there's a place for all of them, right? There's a place to be competitive. There's a place to be collaborative. There's a place to be avoidant. Oh gosh, now I'm blanking on the other 2. Accommodating, thank you, and compromising is the middle there, right in the that middle. We've decided to put in the middle. There's a place for all of these, and I think communication, conflict, pedagogy starts with an uncovering through communication style. Also, like, have all of your conflicts included a pattern of escalation? Have you not even been shown or felt, and I think that's a huge part of this, has your body not experienced down-regulated conflict?
Yes.
And if that's the case, you're not going to use any of these skills. Why would you think they would work?
It's fantasy.
Yeah. And so I don't know if that's totally fair to either field, but sometimes when I am working with folks who come more from a negotiation background versus who have come more from like a conflict communication, it feels like that's the general territory, that we're both sort of have a similar belief of process and we have similar tools that are going on, but sometimes it's like we're island hopping in different directions a little bit, if that makes sense.
Yeah. The guiding tool, in my mind, at least the program on negotiation, is some version of the 7 elements, which is just saying that there are discrete, well, maybe not discrete. There is a collectively exhaustive group of things that we can identify and almost like label in negotiation behaviorally. And those are the 7 elements. The thing is that communication is one of those elements. And insofar as it sends or receives a signal, every single move highlights communication. It is communication and interest. It's not just like, at least to my mind, an interest move. It's, you're sharing your interests. You're emotionally intelligent enough to talk about them. It communicates something to me at a meta level. And communication is also meant to hold the entire process. So I think in many ways, communication is the hardest working beyond relationship. And it's related, like, the tone that I communicate is an implication of our relationship, or a reflection of how I see it, and how warm, hostile, domineering, whatever. So I think that negotiation cheats in some ways with this, keeping this element in the 7 elements, because the things that you're saying make a lot more sense. And that this could be like a very random tangent, but the fact that you referenced a circle versus the straight ladder makes so much sense to me, just in terms of like, I think male lawyers like would erect something. And I guess that's not fair. Yeah. Like that's not fair. No, from the ed school, but I just mean to say a lot of the original PON tools, from my perspective, take emotional, mindful things literally from family systems and say, look at this neat little ladder. Look at this 4-quadrant tool, which is, by the way, a tool we should talk about. And Roger Fisher had many brilliant ones, and nothing is as wonderful or as practical as a theory. But it's just, sorry, you had thoughts on.
I think that's actually a very helpful description. And I hope we're being fair to fields. And, if somebody's listening to this and they're like, I totally disagree, like, come on our podcast so we can talk about that.
Yeah, enlighten us.
But I do agree that there's something that's helpful about the metaphor around also the roots of communication theory that is, I don't mean feminist in that it was all women. It actually there were a lot of men in the origins of communication scholarship, but it was feminist in the sense of the way that education has become feminized, right? So not to get too heady here, but education is a field that was dominated by men, right? Male teachers. And as women entered that field, it became sort of less, to some extent, they were paid less nobilized in a way. And that is a reflection of our society, I think, downgrading or discrediting women to some extent. But I still think of education as a feminist field in the way that they're thinking sort of holistically about interventions. And communication owes a lot to education, and the people who have sort of married thinking about how to interact with students and give them communication tools that now I actually feel like there's a resurgence of, because we kind of had this gap where it was like, you know, these communication tools, understanding conflict, these things are really important. And then in business, we were like, and they can help us grow business and make a lot of money. And that sort of blew up. And then I feel like now we're sort of having this return, or this marrying of saying like, okay, these things are becoming increasingly important, maybe because of computers and sort of non-human entities, we're sort of bringing it back to a human perspective, or human
maybe
focus.
even mechanical instead of organic. And I wrote something down that, I mean, Elaine said a lot of things, but she said something about that, like thinking, I'm going to butcher a little bit, but thinking purely in terms of utility, like economic utility, undercuts utility, right? So in some ways, by not having an expansive definition of what utility means or what value means, just flattening it to being, it could make me money. Okay, yeah, I do think that it could. And I do think that is part of the value proposition of good relationships. And if that's the driving motivation, like that is not a solution. Like, for instance, I think the best example is talking about tactical empathy, right? Empathy is not hard enough, masculine enough. So it must be tactical for it to be accepted in that way, to my mind. If you're doing it as a tactic, as opposed to a strategy, right? My strategy is an unconditional positive regard. I'm going to respect them as a human, and therefore this will naturally come out. It's a tactic to get something I want. I would argue that's really going to be hard to do consistently if your mindset, if your frame is tactic, right? It is not, empathy is a byproduct of, I would say, a framework or a mindset. And if you try to just do it and focus on, I'm thinking about double loop learning, which is also Chris Argyris, by the way, ladder of inference. This double loop learning idea is really, really important, and something that I think you can really differentiate negotiation resources by. If someone is just telling you to do a behavior or change a behavior, just like Colleen, you mentioned about Elaine saying, in terms of like, you can't just say speak up. Of course you can, right? Forget even beyond the ladder and having different perspectives. The things we say are the products of our mindset. So when we do negotiation training, we have to look at the embedded assumptions that only come out while you're negotiating. People know how we ought to negotiate, but we don't do that thing. They know how to coach, but when they're in it, it's very differently. And there are a lot of reasons for this. And one is that idea of cognitive distance, for sure, neutrality, or not being able to get to the balcony, or being naturally unaffected, which also relates to some extent of our watching, how we watch Real Housewives, and why it might be soothing to like not be in it, and that comfort of that distance. But simply to say, these fields flow. And I just wanted to add one other thing before I forget. I'm sorry for being so chatty today, Colleen.
I love it.
Two other things about the ladder. I know I said there was a most important thing, but that's just because I get excited. I want to emphasize it. But I really think that the biggest thing in the ladder is the gap between selecting data and interpreting it. That is me mindfulness. That is Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication, the ability to separate analysis, objective analysis, what a camera in the corner of the room would pick up, versus judgment. And judgment sneaks in verbs, in everything. Even if we say like, often, always, never, those are like very classic ones. When you want to tell someone that something's bothering you, you tell them they always do it, and they don't always do it. Congratulations, you just step back.
No, I'm so glad you brought that up, because I feel like that articulates also maybe this different starting points that I'm thinking about. Like some of the most effective conflict trainings, actually almost all of them that I've been a part of, the first day is just like, what is perception, and how do you teach people that multiple perspectives exist in a room in a really nuanced and impactful way. Because we can't give anything if they don't understand that. So I actually think it's a really great example to mention of like, how do I even start to understand my attention and what draws my attention? And I wanted to say one thing about Elaine mentioning motivation, and how do you get people to sort of engage productively, or how do you motivate people? And she talks about it's a calculation for her of deciding what's worth it, and it's not worth it to live in a skewed reality. And if you can help someone understand that perhaps that can be motivating. And I just thought, what we're talking about mostly on the internet today are delulus, delusionships. And this is exactly that. You know, we sort of become aware of, at least as a society, there's a universal awareness of our own delulus, our own delusional beliefs. And that, I'm hopeful, is a good place to start, because at least if we recognize that we carry with us our own delusions, perhaps then we might be motivated to undo some of them or to interrogate some of them.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Or hopefully at least name them and respond to them for people who won't name them themselves.
Have you heard that term, Max? Delulu?
No, I'm loving it.
The delulu is the salulu.
I have so much to learn from you.
The TikTokers are all about it.
Oh boy. I wanted to emphasize something that you mentioned and that Elaine said, which is that when we exclude voices, we warp our sense of reality. So listening isn't just for listening's sake. If you wonder why there's a divide, at least in the US and many other places, it's because people aren't included in the conversations because their ladder isn't welcome, right? The conclusion isn't welcome. And there may be real social utility, like for certain affinity groups, or like it may be like not everyone should be at every meeting. And at the same time, if we're trying to create spaces where we're doing what I would say is the work of peace building or reconnecting or putting the world back together to some extent, simply to have it, identify it as part of the ladder and not have it escalate or saying, yeah, that's what you think. That's been your experience. Yeah. And, you know, there's another Thich Nhat Hanh quote, something like, we're not punished for our vices, we're punished by them. So like, let's take racism or sexism, or let's take someone who's like afraid of other cultures. Great. Then you're missing out on like a lot of what different perspectives, languages, foods, ideas, like that's your own poverty to some extent. So I'd also love to just kind of preach in terms of not trying to fight fire with fire in that way, because it's pretty explosive, but just to think about like, if I can contain conflict with language. And if we as groups and teams can build containers that can handle even deeply divided stuff, that's the solution, as opposed to just like an individual in a training be able to walk away with a tool that they feel comfortable enough to whip out, and then yay, they get a promotion, right? Like more gradual.
Yeah, absolutely. One more note I want to make is that I felt so embarrassed, Max, when Elaine was like, well, how I was going to answer this question is that you need to really respect individual agency. Meanwhile, I had just like stripped her of her agency. Look, and on the one hand, I was like, well, I'm glad that I could be the example. And on the other hand, internally, I was mortified. Just to explain a little bit of my motivation, I selfishly wanted to hear her answer everything, but also Max and I are still learning how to podcast, and I was a little worried that she asking two questions at once wouldn't translate well. It would be hard for people to follow. So that's part of why I paused things. But I will say, I just feel like I should let everyone know, if you also cringed for me, don't worry. I cringed for myself tenfold. I was like, oh God, I just read this book on not taking away people's agency, and here I am.
I'd like to fully disagree with you, as I believe the cringe is mine. So asking multiple compound questions that I had to watch myself ask. While I tell people not to ask compound questions because it's confusing. If you have a question, ask the question and get out of the way of that question. And I give, I think, a masterful litany of questions and monologue that deprive her of her own answering of the question. So I actually saw that as like a really helpful facilitation move. Just be like, hey, long-winded dude, let's hear that one. So we can all cringe. That's the beauty of collaborative negotiations. We can all share in the loss. That's a tough one.
Yeah, absolutely. And